Thanks so much for joining us today. Sorry for the delay. Some technical difficulties that I'm sure we're all familiar with by now. But once again, thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to be hosting this discussion on basic income today. But before we begin, we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. The island of Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations and is now home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. As we are meeting on a virtual platform, we also acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are gathered from today and the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call the lands that we reside on home. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples in our communities and from coast to coast. With this in mind, as students at the School of Community and Public Affairs, we're really interested in how we can use public policy to pursue the values that are most important to us and can lead us to a more equitable and fair society. We hope that we can all come away from this event with a deeper understanding of the potential that basic income has to address the social and economic inequalities that exist in our communities and bring us toward a more just future for everyone in Canada. I'll now pass things over to our moderator, Matthew Arrett, who is a journalist and co-founder of the Rising Tide Foundation, which is dedicated to cross-cultural dialogue and understanding. Thank you.
So I know that we're running a little bit behind schedule. Thank you very much for asking me to moderate and for being here to all of our panelists. A few months ago when Aaron had asked me to moderate, my first response was, well, I don't really know enough about universal basic income to possibly do a good job. But then I realized I don't know that much, and that's a great reason to moderate, because this is going to give me an opportunity, as it will give all of our guests here in the audience, a chance to learn from the best minds who have spent a lot of time working on an understanding of what this is, the pros, the cons, and how it applies or doesn't apply. We're going to find out to the Canadian situation. So we're lucky to have a great group of panelists with us, all of whom come to us from different areas of expertise and experiences that inform their understanding of basic income. I'd like to introduce everyone briefly and then just hand the space over to them. First, we have C. Strauss, who is a staff lawyer at the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund in Toronto. As part of their work at LEAF, they are chair of LEAF's Basic Income Project, which is looking at how basic income can address issues of gender equality through an intersectional lens. Their final report will be released this summer. Next is Dr. Evelyn, health economist at the University of Manitoba. Her current research focuses on the health and social consequences of anti-poverty interventions and the cost-effectiveness of healthcare interventions. She has studied basic income in Canada extensively and is the author of Basic Income for Canadians. We have Floyd Marinescu with us. He is Executive Director of UBI Works, where their mission is to shift the conversation to recognize basic income as both an economic need and an economic opportunity. As part of his advocacy work, Floyd helped organize 120 Canadian CEOs to endorse basic income in Canada in October 2018, and he is especially interested in the ability of basic income to allow for more entrepreneurship and innovation. We also have Emily here. She is the National Coordinator at Canada Without Poverty and holds an MPA from Queen's. Emily's lived experience informs her work at Canada Without Poverty, where she is committed to using education, policy, and human rights law to promote systemic change and improve the lives of marginalized people in Canada. Finally, we have Dr. Lindsay, Scientific Director of Fiscal and Economic Policy at the University of Calgary. She has also just been appointed to the new Federal Task Force on Women and the Economy. She was also a member of the BC Basic Income Panel, which studied the feasibility of basic income as a potential tool for poverty reduction and how it relates to existing supports in British Columbia. They released their final report earlier this year. So now that we know a little bit more about each of our panelists, let's give each panelist a few minutes to tell us a little bit more about their work and insight into basic income. So the questions that I think might spurn this on, each panelist will have about 2 minutes. Tell us a little bit about how you understand basic income. What are the pros and the cons, the challenges that we may face in creating a national basic income? So let's start with Evelyn. If you could take your mic off of mute.
Thanks very much for the kind introduction. Basic income, I think, in Canada has come to be understood as an income-tested benefit. It's a guaranteed income close to the poverty line for those with no other income. And it also offers a reduced benefit for low-income workers. So most advocates for basic income in Canada don't imagine that basic income is intended to replace public services like healthcare or supports for people with disabilities. What it does do is to streamline and enhance cash transfers that we receive from various levels of government. Things like provincial income assistance, the GST credit, some other tax credits, depending on what province you live in, for their provincial counterparts. Importantly, basic income doesn't depend on work history. You don't need to have worked a certain number of hours in order to qualify. And this helps to ensure that clients actually receive the support they need when they need it, without having to navigate a complex bureaucracy during moments of stress. I see basic income as lubricating the social safety net. It's a part of the social safety net. It doesn't replace it. All of our public services work better when people have enough income to identify their own needs and to address their own needs on their own timetable. Thank you.
Thank you. So Emily, same questions.
Thank you. So at Canada Without Poverty, we envision a Canada without poverty, it's said in the name. And this is for everyone living in Canada. So not just Canadian citizens, but extending it to Indigenous people who may not identify as Canadian, those with precarious immigration status, refugees, and importantly, migrant workers and people who work in Canada, but perhaps don't have permanent status. So we see UBI, if it is implemented using a human rights framework and extended to all these people living in Canada, as a way to streamline social assistance, a way to raise the social assistance, which right now sits below the poverty line in all provinces and territory. It's quite a crisis. And we see this as a tool that we can use to, get Canadians and people living in Canada to be living dignified and adequate standards of living, as currently is just not the case, unfortunately, for 1 in 8 people in Canada. So yes, UBI can be a great tool. There are a lot of challenges and considerations, and Canada Without Poverty and myself will speak to these. But as long as it's not, as Evelyn mentioned, as long as it's not a tool that is used in its original sort of conservative ideology to sort of replace other social services such as mental health, healthcare, supports for those with disabilities, we can see it as a very positive thing, as it is a very streamlined. That being said, there's also the jurisdictions of getting the provinces to all agree. So we'll have a lot to talk about, but that's at least what we sort of think about at Canada Without Poverty.
Okay, thank you. C, how about yourself?
Hi, yes. So thank you so much for inviting Leaf to speak on the panel. Thanks to all of the panel organizers, and thanks to all of the other panelists for agreeing to speak. I'm really looking forward to what everybody has to say today. I'm also coming to you from Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, home of the Kanien'kehá:ka and many other First Nations. So just quickly, I think that, we're kind of on the same page as what Evelyn and Emily were discussing. The way that LEAF is looking at it is a little bit different in that we're assessing the potential for basic income to address longstanding issues of gender and racial socioeconomic inequality. So what we're doing with our project is looking at, in the current context, what does it mean to have economic gender equality, and how much of the way can basic income get us there? So while it's a bit of a different thing, it's ultimately getting at some of the same goals that Evelyn and Emily were just discussing in terms of, certainly no income floor would be supported by LEAF to the extent that it would put in peril the ability to have quality, accessible public services and programs for all. So we've developed a set of principles and objectives, working off of the work of basic income advocates who always start with a set of principles and objectives. What are the goals of basic income? If the goal of basic income, for instance, is to reduce or even eliminate poverty, what are the goals of economic gender equality more broadly. So we've developed a pretty broad list of principles and objectives, including trans-inclusive gender equality, intersectionality, decolonization and land back, dignity for all, anti-poverty. It goes on, but I think in doing so, it helps us to kind of focus and understand what we're looking for in a basic income. So just one quick example would be, as Emily was saying, if something doesn't include all people in Canada, including people with precarious immigration status, then it's probably not something we are going to support as a basic income, given one of the principles being migrant rights and, you know, anti-racism. So like an example being the Canada Child Benefit, which doesn't currently include people with precarious immigration status. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Lindsay, you're up next.
Apparently I can't start my video. You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. Oh, start my video. There we go.
Okay.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll just because I'm coming here from Alberta, I just like take that opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which is where I'm coming from, and the city of Calgary itself is home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. So, you know, I think we're kind of all going to say something along the same lines. Here, I'll acknowledge, you know, one of the things when we were doing our work is we came across a lot of words: guaranteed basic income, negative income tax, livable income, citizens income, participation income, universal basic income. These are all terms that have been used to talk about a cash transfer guarantee. And there are no uniform definitions to these terms. Reminds me of my work when I was, I did a lot of work in the underground economy, and it was the same thing. People used terms that had no universal definition, and you can use these words and two people are talking about two different things when they're using the same words. And if you want to look at my Twitter feed, look at the arguments going on about the definition of universal. And there are, in fact, people who do believe that universal means a demogrant that goes to everybody. And there are people in Canada who say that they should replace a lot of the services that that Evelyn talked about. So there isn't a unifying feature here, but we, I think, as experts in this area would agree with what Evelyn said, that this is about a means-tested income that is supposed to be much more simple. So it's not a single uniform policy, it's a range of policy proposals, but those policy proposals is not just a cash transfer. And I think we have to really make sure that we fundamentally understand this, because this is really important. In particular, when I think about Bill C-273, that's tasking the Minister of Finance as responsible for developing a strategy, which I think is very problematic for thinking about basic income with some of these principles. The key underlying principle of a basic income is to support autonomy. And around that is the idea of simplicity, respect, economic security, and social inclusion. And then beyond that, to actually design the program, it's a matrix, it's a 13x3 matrix of design principles that this is where the complexity comes from, of having to know what are you trying to achieve and how are we going to get there, and how do these choices actually bump up against some of these principles that we have laid out. And when you have somebody like me with expertise in tax policy, in policy implementation, and having to walk a fine line between the tax nerds in both CRA and finance, as well as benefit administrators, you know, poverty advocates, there are some real challenges that come into play here, where this is why we end up with programs that don't achieve the objectives of of poverty advocates. And it's because the tax nerds take over, and you can't let them take over, please. You can't. So I really think that we're at this phase where we've really got to be much more careful about what is the design and implementation, and make sure that we're making choices there that achieve those objectives of a basic income and aren't just another cash transfer.
Hey, thank you, Lindsay. So Floyd, how about yourself?
Thank you. So I'll open with a brief personal story. I grew up in a house with domestic violence, and if my mother had a basic income, she would have had more options, more freedom, and also knowing that she had that financial independence would have resulted, I think, in a different treatment. Knowing that she had the ability to leave at any time, had the means to do that. And that's why basic income fundamentally is about personal freedoms, about the options to do what is best for oneself, and not necessarily be stuck with the cards that have been dealt to them. This is really important, and becoming increasingly important, especially for young people listening to this panel, because life is getting harder, especially for working people as well, and for young people. Millennials, or whatever we're calling the new generation, will be making less wealth, have less opportunity to earn higher incomes than their parents and grandparents. We could say that the social contract where hard work gets you ahead for many people is broken. Jobs aren't working when wages are not keeping up with cost of living. A lot of the issues that are facing these structural changes, you could broadly call the fourth industrial revolution, a time of massive transformation. And some of the features of this are labor market polarization, where the middle class is shrinking and more of the jobs that we're creating are lower income and lower quality. De-skilling, where university educated people are going out and taking jobs that used to be taken by high school educated people, perhaps because that's all they can find left after all the automation we've already experienced. And people with high school educations are often leaving the labor market entirely. We're Canada's #1 in the world for educated people living in poverty. This is a structural issue. So we see basic income as a bridge to move through this fourth industrial revolution, a transition to help people pursue better opportunities for themselves. Also as an income supplement, so that even working people can have a share, a small share, but a share of a growing and increasingly automated economy. We need a system where people don't fall into poverty in the first place, alleviating a lot of the issues that call for a lot of the changes to our social assistance systems. We've seen that now with CERB, how we needed a program that was there in time of an emergency, otherwise would have overwhelmed our social assistance systems. So we don't see UBI or basic income guarantee as a handout or form of charity. It's how we can reclaim our slice of the economic pie and how we can have a future greater prosperity for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Are you able to hear me by chance? There's a bit of a technical issue on my side here.
I can hear you.
You can? Okay.
Yes.
So the video on my side has just totally failed. That's okay. All right. So thank you for expanding on your works and insights. We're very much looking forward to hearing how they influence the unfolding of this conversation. So to go into the conversation a little bit further, as Nadia mentioned in her opening words, we're all here because we're looking for meaningful avenues on the road to a more just society. In that case, someone's asking me to start the video, but no, the video simply will not start on my side. I'm sorry for whoever is asking me. So yeah, in that case, what does a more just future for Canada look like for you? How does basic income help each of us reach this kind of future? So we have about 2 minutes approximately per panelist, and let's start with Emily. Sorry, were you able to hear me?
Yes, I was, sorry. So similar to what I said in an opening, a just future includes all people living in Canada. Right now, so much of our social assistance, so much of the benefits that I guess have been related to UBI, such as the child tax benefit, exclude people who have precarious status, people who are, doing backbreaking work for our economy, especially our agricultural workers, and they're excluded from a lot of our benefits. I'd like to draw attention to the child tax benefit. So those who have precarious status, but even have children born in Canada, don't qualify. So a just economy, a just future has to include all the people living in Canada. We have far too much space and far too much money and resources to really just exclude these people. It's really unfair. It's not living up to human rights. And sorry, I'm just trying to remember that second part of that question. And if we develop a very holistic basic income that, in my opinion, shouldn't just be one basic income, should be aggregated based on the province, based on the need of the region, then we could potentially achieve this. Again, just any call to at least rise social assistance rates where they are currently is something that we support, but we're always there pushing the government one step further. I really liked what Lindsay said about not letting the tax nerds take over. That I was applauding in my room, because it's so true. We bring our lived experience. Like Floyd, I have lived experience growing up with, surrounding poverty, a mother with drug abuse, a father with mental illness. And so we're always trying to get the government to just, be remarkable, put one step further and really serve all the people in Canada. So if UBI is the way to get there, then let's do it.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay, do you have any thoughts or remarks on that question as well?
I have to remember to unmute myself. Okay. So, I mean, we had a whole chapter on what justice means in our BC Basic Income Report. This is very complex. What does it mean? What is the standards of justice? And, one of the things, I guess, probably because I have to walk a line between, politics and policy and implementation and second best solutions a lot. And probably because I'm on Twitter and I get yelled at by angry people on a fair amount. When we think about social justice, I have to think about and maybe I'm going to go back a bit. We talked about one of the things that happened when we were first formed as a committee was the cancellation of the Ontario Basic Income Pilot. It took our breaths away, that we could not believe that something like that could happen to people with very little notice and what have you. And so one of the things that we really took seriously very early on in our work was thinking about saleability and permanency, that you cannot have a program like this that when, like in our case in BC, the BC Liberals are just going to come in and cancel it at a moment's notice. There has to be a permanency here, and it has to be done in a way to make sure that it is survivable through all of these sorts of things. And I know a lot of work was done in Ontario to try to ensure that, and it just didn't happen. And so this was one of the reasons why we went out and looked for some philosophies about, quid pro quo, and we found this, our common bowl, which now I'm not going to be able to find it. Oh God, I hate it when I do this. It was a saying from a First Nations chief from BC that talked about how in society we have to have this principle of reciprocity, that when times are good, we give to the bowl, and when we are in need, we are able to freely take from the bowl. And again, that gets at the stigma and all of that kind of stuff. But we share and we all contribute, and then we take what we need when we need it. And so when we were thinking about social justice, we had to merge these two sides sides together, because and I think that that's often forgotten about when we think about social justice. Social justice is two sides, and that is what ensures the permanency and the buy-in from both sides. So I'll bring that as not a different perspective, but just to balance off to ensure that permanency, which is so important to these kinds of.
Okay, I think your last couple of words are cut off, but I think that was your closing idea,
Done.
right?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Too
right.
quick on the draw there.
All right, so C, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I started talking about this in my first little introduction there, but a more just economic future and how to do it through an intersectional approach is exactly what Leif is trying to think about, and understanding what economic gender equality is meaning right now. I'll just say, so just two things. I was really struck in a panel in the summer on women in the care economy. There was a really great series, which many people probably saw, the pay equity, Faye Faraday and Jan Boroway's pay equity series. And at a panel on women in the care economy, Pam Palmater's, a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, activist, and politician, spoke about the trifecta crisis of COVID disproportionately impacting Indigenous women because of the crisis of genocide, pandemics of racism, and sexism. And on a panel about women in the care economy, she said, it's hard to think about workplace or childcare when you're talking about life and death issues at home, when your kids are apprehended at crisis level rates, for instance. Those are the types of primary considerations that need to be there. So in thinking for us about what a just economic future looks like, we're trying to think about what it looks like for all women and gender diverse people across Canada, and where people's struggles are right now, and what basic human rights need to be met before even you get to a question about workplace equality, for instance, or gender equality in the workplace. A second thing I'll say is we have a researcher who's focusing on the disability aspect of the work for us, Dr. Sally Kimson, who's a critical disability studies scholar and a consultant and healthcare navigator. And she is looking specifically about, when thinking about what a just economic future looks like in terms of basic income, a huge amount of the people who will be affected by a switch to basic income are people with disabilities, women in particular with disabilities, because a greater number of women than men report having a disability. And so if we're thinking about justice in that way, I think part of the promise of basic income is potentially a reduction in the amount of the navigational complexity of disability benefits right now. And so when thinking about a just economic future for women and gender diverse people with disabilities, Dr. Kimson is looking at the amount of surveillance that women and gender diverse people submit to in order to get their benefits now, and whether a basic income could change that, or if it's income tested and could require similar review processes of disability status and income, would that change? So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Floyd, how about yourself?
Statistics Canada recently released an analysis of social mobility in Canada. It found that we're moving up the Great Gatsby curve, that people's economic future is increasingly determined by that of their parents. I think that's an unjust future. I think we want a future where people believe they'll be better off, that they can make more money, have more time, all these things that frankly were promised or we expected from an economy that is increasing in its productivity and its technological prowess. But if you look around you, you see that's not happening. It's getting harder for people. We're creating more lower quality and lower income jobs than higher income jobs, and certainly more than middle income jobs. So what kind of future does that leave us? And it's not just Canada, it's the entire G20, it's the whole Western world. If you're living in China right now, things are getting better for you. Your middle class is growing. We need to reclaim that kind of hope for us here. And I think part of it is acknowledging this greater economic transformation we're in, the impacts of the fourth industrial revolution, how life is getting harder for people. And so therefore I see basic income again as key to a just future, so people have hope and can see that all this progress, all this wealth creation is somehow benefiting all of us. That's why I'm with Andrew Yang when he says that we need to find a way to make people beneficiaries of technological change directly, because especially those whose jobs were automated away often, almost always experience lower pay and lower quality work afterwards as their jobs are not valued. And that happened actually to my father and uncle who worked in Ontario's automotive manufacturing sector. And when we saw the apocalypse of more than 4 million manufacturing jobs in the early 2000s, which was shown to be primarily due to automation, with 6 times more jobs lost to automation in the trade, half of those people didn't go back to work, and half of that half went on disability payments. So this is happening every day right now. Automation is happening in warehouses, in our accounting and back offices, in our retail outlets, and no one's talking about it. So at this point, I think it's almost, it is missing the bigger picture to discuss basic income only in the context of poverty alleviation. We should be discussing it in the context of economic transformation to provide more hope and a just future for everyone.
Thank you very much. Evelyn, do you have any thoughts you'd like to contribute?
You know, I struggle with these issues a lot. When I first started looking at basic income, I came at it from the perspective of safety and security. A basic income sets a floor. A basic income is a promise that no one will ever have to live in poverty. And it's easy enough to find the roots of that in my own background. But with a colleague for the last year and a half, we've been engaged in a different kind of a project. We've spent a lot of time talking to frontline service providers, people going through transitions in their lives, so kids aging out of the foster care system, people who'd been released from prison and were trying to rebuild their lives, newly sober people who needed sort of non-judgmental access to supports as they try to build new lives. Women leaving difficult situations. So we had this sort of mass of humanity, mostly in Winnipeg, but not entirely, of people. And we basically asked them 3 questions. How does the current system work for you? And you can imagine what the responses were. What do you think about this basic income thing? It turns out many people hadn't thought about this basic income thing at all, so they didn't have a whole lot to say about it. But what do you think you need? And as I said, when I started thinking about basic income, I thought about safety, I thought about security, I thought about it like universal health care. It's something there for me when I need it. If I ever need it, it'll be there. But what people told us was something a little bit different. What they told us was that they were experiencing coercion in all aspects of their life, that there were so many people who wanted to help them. But the help very quickly turned into one form or another of attempting to make them into a different kind of a person, to try to make them live different kinds of lives than the lives they wanted to live for themselves. And so that focus on autonomy is something that I really took home. And Kayak Robinson, who was one of the commissioners for the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women, used a phrase that I keep repeating because I think it was a very profound one. And that is that what a basic income does is it allows people to identify their own issues and to address those issues in their own way and on their own timetable. It doesn't force anybody to accept the reality of the dominant culture and to shape their lives to fit into the dominant culture. That's where I am now. I don't know where I'll be a year from now, but thank you.
No, thank you. All right, so for the third question for this segment, which will still go to each of the panelists. In light of our experience over the last year, how has the pandemic informed the discourse, the debate on basic income? What can we learn from the rollout and the impacts of CERB? So for this particular twofold question, let's start with Evelyn.
I think a lot of things. I mean, I think one of the things that happened is that many people who never thought they'd be looking to the government for help suddenly found themselves applying for CERB support, and they realized what a difference it could have made in their lives. I'm not sure what impact that will have going forward. I think a second thing we learned, and this goes back to Lindsay's tax nerd sympathies, we learned that when people are engaged with the real problem and they're given a tight timeline and the imagination to do things differently, they can do things differently. I thought that the way the CERB was implemented was really revolutionary in the sense that people applied online, very simple, straightforward process. They had access to direct access to administrators if they needed help to access the system. They attested to their income. They stated what their income was. And in a very short period of time, money ended up in their bank accounts. Now we know there were issues with the rollout, not least of which because the government couldn't decide what it meant by income. But, you know, setting aside those minor issues of definition, this was a really revolutionary thing to try. And I think it's something to keep in mind as we go forward. We don't have to keep doing things in the future the way we've done them in the past. So I think that's a really important thing. I think the fact that people have seen these support programs work one way or another for the past year means that they're open to thinking about different ways of doing things.
Okay, thank you. Floyd, you're next. Oh, and by the way, if my video or camera or audio should stop working at any time, my internet connection is very choppy all of a sudden, so I do apologize profusely if that happens. So Floyd, go for it.
Yeah, so I want to mention that I'm also very concerned with the point Dr. Ted's raised about the sellability and the permanency of this, which is why I think CERB was exemplified to Evelyn's point that millions of people who would never have thought that they might need any sort of social support suddenly found themselves in need of something like a basic income, and they got it pretty quickly. This is the voting block that really matters, I think, for the future uptake of a basic income. I think CERB also exemplified exactly what a basic income is for. It's there for times of crisis. It's there for times of transition. And it's exactly what the country needed. Imagine how much better off we would have been if a basic income guarantee had already been in place and people immediately could have made better decisions for themselves, facing decisions of how to work and safety or even being fired or not knowing what's coming next. Imagine if we did not do CERB, which again I see as basic income-like in some ways. That would have meant we would be letting people to enter dire poverty, selling off all their assets, going into the extremes of poverty, and then overwhelming the social assistance systems in every province. That would have been crazy. Well, I say that what we're going to see soon with a lot of rapid automation of jobs coming with self-driving trucks, with self-driving cars displacing delivery and taxi and Uber, is going to be could be on a similar scale. And again, it'll overwhelm our systems if we don't have a basic income in place. That's why I think even the departing Bank of Canada Governor, Stephen Poloz, said that we need a CERB-like mechanism to deal with future emergencies like this. Not just national emergencies that threaten middle-class voters that all the parties are fighting for, but emergencies on any individual that any individual has, you know, like my mom or anyone who would have needed to fall back on a basic income that they know they have, not because they're in trouble, but because they're a citizen, and we just have this. I don't mean that basic income should only be for citizens. The CERB also showed that basic income can be there as an automatic stabilizer for the economy. The Royal Bank of Canada recently showed that this larger uptake in consumer spending we've been seeing has been attributed to the CERB, and that's really important, and that's another benefit that we would have in future crises.
Thanks. So, C, do you have any thoughts on the same question?
Sure, just quickly, you know, COVID-19 pandemic exposed the inequalities, many of the inequalities that already existed, but it really highlighted the gendered and racialized nature of essential work and the precarity of that work at the same time. So the undercompensated nature of the work that is happening, and it really brought, I think, people to talk more about the care economy and the ways that we rely on care work in so much of our society, and the ways that that care work is underpaid and undercompensated and is now entirely unpaid for most people as things shut down. So you know, that brought up the need, and then it also brought up the inadequacy of employment insurance schemes and the ways that could compensate people for lack of work. So that all brought, you know, the call for a basic income to the fore, but I think it also brought up the ways in which we need to understand how that will work for women and gender diverse people who are the ones who are disproportionately affected by the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay, let's round it out with yourself.
Thank you. I think I'll try to bring up some divergent topics, which was When the pandemic hit, for the first time for a lot of people, they experienced what vulnerable people in this society experience every day. I actually don't think they learned that. I'm sorry. We were all hopeful. Well, you know what I mean, that there would be some big lessons that were taken away from this. And I don't think that has happened. And I think why I say that is because with the dialogue going on in Ottawa, particularly by a few journalists who are reporting on what they call CERB fraud and the repayments and what have you. I'm just seeing some incredibly repugnant comments about people who rightfully claim the CERB, and they're being demonized because they experienced a very traumatic income shock. I mean, my husband experienced a very big income shock and did claim the CERB, and you know, and rightfully so, because that's what it was there for. It was there to support people through a very sudden and dire income shock. So I'm sorry, I'm not anywhere near as hopeful as everybody else here. My apologies. But one of the other things that happened when that pandemic hit, the panel that I was on, the BC Basic Income panel, was just starting. We were starting to get our trickle of reports in, and we were starting to think about the drafting of our final report. And typically when you think about economists, you think about economists saying, you know, cash is king, and we should give people money as opposed to services. And I had to have a very big debate with my older male colleagues about how cash at that time was not going to provide me with any autonomy. The schools had shut down. I had a young child at home. I literally had no autonomy. And if you had provided me with $2,000 a month, I still had no autonomy because there was no place to send him. There was no schools, there was no childcare. We couldn't have people in our houses. It was any parent of young kids knows that it was a very challenging time. And it reinforced, I think, a few times we've mentioned this, how vital basic services are to individuals, not just vulnerable individuals, but to everybody, and particularly women. Basic services are necessary for us to have a semblance of autonomy in our lives. And so one of the things that we did when we were looking at the provincial support system, 80% of what they offer is services. And provinces actually offer very little in terms of income support. It's the feds that are the big players when it comes to income supports, but they don't offer a lot of services. So, you know, a lot of people who are talking about our report are in fact taking it out of context. When you look at the work that we did there, when you think about some of these fundamental aspects of ensuring that people have access to services, which are so vital to autonomy, you cannot take the provinces out of the job of providing those essential services, and how important it is to keep those in place and to make sure that when the big guns come into town, like the federal government, who delivers these big cash transfer programs, that they work together in a nice fiscal federalist system to ensure that we appropriately support everybody with income and in services, and we don't let the provinces pull back support from services, and we don't let the feds pull back income when we're providing services. So I know Emily talked about fiscal federalism, and Evelyn talked about the nature of services. In our fiscal federalist system, we have to acknowledge the division of powers in our Constitution is what leads to this, and to make sure that we understand how, if we're interested in a basic income, what that means to who comes to the table with the income.
Very interesting points all around. Thank you. So for the next segment of this discussion, we're going to shift gears a little bit and have more focused individual questions. However, each question will be about 10 minutes long in total. And if somebody's answer is shorter than 10 minutes, we're going to open up for anyone else who has a contributing thought that they'd like to interpose. So with that, let's begin with C. LEAP's basic income project is about halfway through their research on questions of gender equality as it relates to basic income policy. Now, I've got a multi-level question, so bear with me. Can you tell us more about how basic income is being explored from an intersectional lens? How also would a basic income respond to the needs of women and gender diverse people? Additionally, can you tell us more about how gender discrimination intersects with other forms of oppression? And finally, how can anti-poverty strategies reduce the need for spending in other areas? Now that's a mouthful, but I'll see. If there's one that you care about more than the others, go for it. Or if you want to try to address all in one shot, you're very talented. I'm sure you can handle it. Good luck.
Thanks for the confidence, Matthew. I'm going to just totally leave aside the last question, but answer, most of the other ones. Yeah, so one thing I wanted to say is, right, so one of the potentials for, and I think Evelyn and Floyd have both mentioned this, one of the potentials that basic income holds out is the potential for safety and security for women and gender diverse people in unsafe situations in their homes. So that's definitely, the ability to address gender-based violence is one of the main reasons why one of the things we'll be looking at. And I think that gets to kind of more complicated questions of design, and it also brings up, questions of behavior that I don't know that we have a lot of answers to, which brings up questions of how to deal with something when there are pilot projects, but having a pilot project on a national scale is a bit difficult, and then retracting it if it doesn't work, what would that mean? So, but thinking through the possibilities and potentials of people having basic income or having a basic income delivered to them that would then make them feel more economically independent and able to leave a bad situation. The question there is whether the design would be distributed, whether the basic income would be distributed according to household or individuals. And so that's just one, I'll just kind of like put that as one thing we're thinking through. But the thing I wanted to talk about more tonight is, so a central objective, among others in the feminist world, of course, is dismantling the gender division of labor and talking about the reality that Lindsay was discussing, not being able to, you have no autonomy when you're taking care of your child, in the ways that was so very clearly brought down on almost like on majority women in the pandemic. And thinking through what a basic income could mean for dismantling the gender division of labor is really interesting and not obvious. So I just wanted to talk about it a little bit right now, because it is a thing, it's a trepidation or it's some sort of concern that feminists have often had with basic income, in terms of, if there's a basic income, the ideal of it, of course, is that you are going to refuse badly paid, undercompensated, precarious work. But if women are mostly engaged in that type of work to begin with, and part-time work, and let's say they're in a double income household where the other person in the household, who's often a man, is earning more, the fear is that women will actually retreat or exit from the labor market. And that's been kind of in basic income literature as a fear for a while. So I just wanted to kind of talk about that, but put it in the context of the pandemic. And in the context of also, so first I'll say it gets us to complicated questions about choice and autonomy, because it's a liberating move for somebody to leave a job that they don't like and to take care of their children potentially. So why would we, as feminists, want to critique that move potentially? It gets to questions of choice and autonomy. But I think for us right now, it's in the territory of the care economy, because so if we think about the care economy, healthcare, long-term care, childcare and early learning, home care, and other services for people with disabilities. I was also at the Canada Summit on Response and Recovery today, and I heard Marie Clark Walker, the Secretary Treasurer of Canadian Labour Congress, talking there about the care economy, who discussed that no substantive progress will be made in achieving gender equality in the workforce until inequalities in unpaid care work are tackled. And they're tackled not just through the redistribution of care work between women and men, but as well as between individuals and the state. So if we're thinking about that, I think it just, like, our question at LEAF will be, how does a basic income play into that? Because if you get a basic income, if we're advocating for valuing care work and for paying it what it's truly worth, then people won't necessarily be leaving those jobs. Those jobs will be fairly compensated. Those jobs will be equitably compensated. If we're thinking about a care economy and what it could do, then we're not necessarily worried about people leaving those jobs. And so, but does the fact that we're redistributing care work outside of the house, but not redistributing it along gender lines matter? Like, it will still be primarily women doing the care work, and more often than not racialized and newcomer women. So I think when we're kind of thinking about what a just gender economic equality future looks like, and we're thinking about how basic income might or might not change people's behavioral decisions, we're also thinking about what it means to adequately compensate and value care work, and how a basic income does or doesn't play into that. And we don't have any answers for that right now. It's just thinking through, it's just understanding that that will be a central part of our analysis. Yeah. I also wanted to just quickly say, I don't know, this is just a question for Lindsay at another time, but to ask just maybe talk a little bit more about what you mean when you say that it's not just a cash transfer, and what are you implying when you're talking about that in terms of basic income. But that's just an aside.
Oh, I would say at this point that you've thrown a curveball at me. Let's maybe, if we have time for at the end, we could maybe throw that out there perhaps.
I can answer it in 30 seconds.
30 seconds, go for it.
30 seconds.
Absolutely.
The principles, right? Autonomy, respect, simplicity, economic security, social inclusion are the principles of a basic income. It's not just a cash transfer with all of those, a complex one with all of these conditions and what have you. It is a very specific program that does deliver cash, but it has these principles at its heart.
Okay, thank you. And we have 4 minutes left for this particular segment. If anybody else has a thought regarding the questions that I threw at C, or any element of those questions, they could feel free to just chime in and throw their 2 cents in. If not, we can just move on to the next question. I'll give people 7 seconds to think that through. Okay, all right.
I think he froze.
Glad it wasn't just me.
How it relates to social determinants of health and its downstream impacts. Additionally, what can basic income do to address things such as the cost of healthcare interventions and access to mental health support? And finally, what impact did MINCOME have on your view of a national basic income?
I assume that question was for me. You froze at the beginning of it.
Sorry.
So I'm going to take the freedom to answer the bits of that question that I want to answer if I can. I think that we've seen a lot of experiments, a lot of short-term experiments, cash transfer experiments that have taken place all over the world. They're all a little bit different. They take place in low-income countries, middle-income countries, high-income countries. We've had 2 attempts in Canada. And one of the findings that's fairly common from all of them is that health improves when a basic income is put in place. When you look at high-income countries like Finland and Canada, they focus usually on mental health. If you look at low-income countries, we might be looking at things like nutrition, particularly of girls and women. But all of these results have led to organizations like the British Medical Journal, the Lancet, the World Health Organization, the World Bank, many others, to identify potential health benefits from the implementation of a basic income. But this raises an interesting question, because we have universal healthcare in Canada. Why should a basic income lead to better health outcomes in a country that has a universal health system? And I'm going to suggest that it's because of the way that basic income works through the social determinants of health. It works to make some of our public services more efficient and more effective. So I want to tell you a story. I just want to give you a little example. It's not a particularly sexy story. It focuses on feet. Feet and teeth are two sort of informal markers of class in Canada. So mine's about feet. Type 2 diabetes is one of the most prevalent chronic conditions that we have in Canada. If you're diagnosed with diabetes, that's not sufficient in and of itself for disability support. You won't necessarily get the disability tax credit or access to provincial disability supports. So a lot of people with type 2 diabetes are working or they're subsisting on provincial income assistance. And when we look at the incidence of type 2 diabetes across the population, we know that people whose incomes fall in the lowest 20% of the distribution, the lowest quintile, get diagnoses of diabetes at twice the rate of people who are in the highest income quintile. Now that's interesting, but what's even more interesting is that once you're diagnosed with diabetes, you're vulnerable to a number of complications, and one of the complications is lower limb amputations. Foot amputations. It turns out that foot amputations is something called an ambulatory care sensitive condition. And what that term means is that if you have access to good quality primary health care, you should never lose your foot due to diabetes, right? It just shouldn't happen. But if you look at the numbers, about 3 times as many people in the lowest income quintile lose their foot, have their foot amputated due to complications of diabetes as people in the highest income quintile. So why do you get these results? In principle, everybody in Canada has access to good quality primary health care at zero cost. And yet we see real outcomes in terms of the quality of health that people receive. And I'm going to suggest that it's because basic income is working on all of the very many complicated social determinants of health that leads to those results. First of all, we know that managing diabetes requires a good diet. We also know that someone on provincial income assistance with no dependents in most provinces gets something like $9,000 a year. We know that food banks aren't a really good source of fresh fruits and vegetables. There used to be a special diet allowance for people on income assistance but not receiving disability support in some provinces that would give a little boost, a little increase in money, but that's been curtailed in most provinces. Secondly, we know that stress exacerbates inflammatory responses within the body, and it exacerbates complications of diabetes. People with inadequate incomes live from crisis to crisis. Stress is a fact of life. They're simply living with more complications. Thirdly, people with low incomes are much more likely to live and work, often with appropriate foot gear and conditions that lend themselves to foot ulcers. They're more likely to be hurt, which leads to worse outcomes down the road. We know that primary health care is free in Canada, but transportation to your appointment is not free. Childcare is not free. After hours access aren't free. Specialized services are often only available in the city. Therefore, your income affects your ability to access public services. We know that in some, but not all provinces, orthotics and foot care are provided. Sometimes they're provided only to people who get disability support. Sometimes they're provided on the basis of income. If you live on reserve, it's not provided. But in any case, even if you're lucky enough to get orthotics, they're meant to be worn inside well-fitting shoes. There's no program in place that buys people shoes. You can access foot care in the private market. It costs about $70 for somebody to drive a van to your house and take care of your feet. But here's the biggest issue of all. I said when I began that teeth and feet are sort of the informal markers of class in Canada. People who are missing teeth are immediately classified, and feet are similar. It turns out that people are embarrassed by their feet. They're embarrassed to visit health professionals for foot care for all kinds of reasons. Their clothing, their shoes, their socks, their foot care regimen put their poverty on display immediately. The stigma of living with poverty is very present in that kind of an environment. And all of that has a whole series of effects. It means, first of all, that people with low incomes present later than high income people. Their conditions are usually more acute, They necessitate more drastic responses from the healthcare system. It turns out that low-income people tend to be diagnosed with chronic conditions about 10 years earlier than high-income people. That sounds inconsistent, but it's not. They simply get sick earlier. By the time you find them, they're in much worse condition. So all of that shows how healthcare services alone are not sufficient, that a basic income actually lubricates the system. It actually makes it possible for people to take advantages of the services that are made available to them. You asked me about costs. It turns out that some of the cost is very direct. Poor health that leads to hospitalizations and drastic interventions like foot amputations are pretty expensive. They have direct and they have indirect costs. Keeping somebody in a rehab hospital for weeks or months is expensive, but the indirect costs, the intangible costs, are even greater. If the patient's previous work involved physical labor, they need to be retrained. If the patient lived in a rural or a remote setting, they might need to relocate to the city to get healthcare on an ongoing basis. We know that lower limb amputations are associated with premature deaths, so years of quality life are going to be lost by individuals who face these complications. So the costs are material, but they're also intangible and they're all too human. And I think one conclusion of this is very clear. Universal services are never really universal. The most marginalized people in society would be better served by our public services if they also had access to a basic income, to a guarantee that would allow them to make use of those services. Thank you.
No, thank you. And we still have a couple of minutes for this segment. Does anybody have something they'd like to add or respond to on this issue of health and UBI?
Basic income is really about hope. When you don't have hope, you don't have health. It's really simple as that. And we need hope. And I think applying to all kinds of means-tested programs that you feel like a second-class citizen for being in them, even if they're helping you, is not conducive to hope and dignity. I have a couple of friends that are on disability, and one of them has bipolar. And this person is afraid to go get a job because they'll lose their benefits. And what if they have a sudden outburst suddenly and that they can't control and they get fired? Then they have to, who knows how long it'll take them to get back on their benefits. These are kind of the perverse incentives that makes the social assistance system not work and call for a basic income. So I see basic income as an excellent underpinning for all other social programs to be built on top of. You know, $1 is $1, whether it comes from one program or 300. Why not consolidate the cash parts of the programs and allow any additional income supplements and additional services to come from other programs so that at least people know they won't lose their basic income. It's easy to get back if they take a risk that is better for them and better for a more productive economy.
Thanks. Can I just make one more sentence since I was so economical in my use of time? When I talk about basic income, there are usually people who come up and talk to me afterwards. And one group of people is very predictable. And these are people with invisible disabilities. A lot of people who are on the spectrum, if that's the right phrase to use, a lot of people with mental health issues, people with periodic conditions who find it very, very difficult to access disability supports. And they all usually point to a basic income as being a lifesaver because they don't fit. They don't fit into a standard workday. They can't commit to showing up on time for jobs and meeting what's required of them. And at the same time, they don't have the kind of obvious disability that's easy to document to qualify for provincial or federal support. And so I think one of the benefits of basic income is dealing with these people who are just a little bit outside the norm, the people who don't, again, who don't fit our standard definitions of how it is people ought to behave and how they ought to fit into the system we've built. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We still have about a minute. So if there's anyone else who had an additional contribution, now's the time. If not, we'll go on to the next question. Okay, so Lindsay, I'm going to simplify my approach here a little bit and just ask you one targeted question, and then if need be, I'll throw in a follow-up or two, or three. Your research with the BC Basic Income Panel recommends a more targeted and incrementalist approach. What are the advantages to this?
Okay, am I on? Yes, I am unmuted. Okay. I think in order to be able to understand that, we have to have an understanding of where the panel came in, what our mandate was, what information that we had, and what particularly we were trying to achieve. So, you know, it is important to remember that the election that was had in BC, not just in the fall, but back in 2017, came after 16 years of the BC Liberals being in power. And that, by the end of their term, at the end of that 16 years, there was a lot of extreme frustration in the province because of the continued cuts to programs. It was, you know, when you think about, you know, I often get called a neoliberal and I still struggle with that term. But when I think about when people call me a neoliberal, I mean, I think that's what they're thinking about, right? I mean, it was all, you know, we all need to go work and make money, and that everybody else is lazy. But that's something I do not believe, by the way. And so the erosion of social supports over those 16 years was actually very, very severe in the province, and there was extreme frustration. So that whole election was about an election between two competing visions for the province. And it ended up in a stalemate. I don't know if you all remember, because it took us about 6 months to actually figure out who our government was after that election. And it returned a coalition government of the NDP and the Greens. And as part of that coalition agreement was a commitment to develop a poverty reduction strategy. The province didn't have one, never has had one. Well, it does now. It hadn't had one, and they wanted to set targets and what have you. So in the fall of 2017, it was the first, one of the very, very first things this coalition government did was establish a Ministers' Advisory Forum on poverty reduction. It was a 13-member panel that went around the province for a year and a half and consulted with more than 8,000 people and groups. And what they learned during those extensive consultations was that the province needed to do more about poverty. Poverty in British Columbia rivaled that in the United States, to give you a context of what BC was dealing with. But there was no consensus. I think this is very important for people to understand. There was no consensus in those consultations as to what was the right approach. Some mentioned a basic income. Some mentioned the importance of basic services. There was no consensus in that process. And that's when we were formed, was after a very extensive consultation period. We were given all of those documents. It was thousands and thousands of pages from that consultation period. We met with that advisory panel at least 3 times, possibly 4. I had a car accident and had a concussion, and so it was a little vague at that point in time. But we had all of that information, and we extensively analyzed all of that, and that's where we kind of came in. We had all of those lived experiences. We read through what people had experienced and looking through the system. And that's where we started our work. You know, people talked about we wanted a basic income. Other people talked about we just needed to do some basic changes to the system and it would be better, because the system is pretty responsive. It's not very respectful, but it's pretty responsive. And BC had been increasing its rates after having been frozen for a significant amount of time. BC had also brought in some really essential services. If you don't know, BC has pharmacare, by the way. We also have a dental program that we actually made some recommendations about to make it more expansive. And so, you know, some of these aspects that you think about, maybe, for example, in Ontario as being the status quo, we had actually already made a lot of strides in this area. And we're coming at this from a very, very different perspective of, you know, this is where we are now. This is what we wanted to achieve in our poverty reduction strategy. Now, how do we go about doing it? And when it was about a year into our work, when poverty statistics were released, BC had already met its poverty reduction targets. We could argue whether or not they were reached targets when they were set, but they had met their poverty reduction targets that were set. They were not making any progress on the depths of poverty. Because a lot of our programs, it's very simple to hit those ones that are right below that poverty line. It's the ones that are the most vulnerable, that are the hardest to get. 97% of homeless people do not file their taxes. Upwards of what we're now at, 1/3 of First Nations parents living on reserves are still not getting the Canada Child benefit for rightful reasons, because when you are a First Nations person and you report a birth of a child, what happens? Somebody comes and takes that child away, and BC has one of the worst reputations in this area. Saskatchewan, I think, yeah. The prairies are not good here, but I mean, there's some reasons, fundamental reasons, and so we're looking at all of this information. And when we looked at, I think very poignantly, who were the most vulnerable in the depths of poverty, where we had experienced absolutely no strides of poverty reduction. It was youth aging out of care. It was people with disabilities on the disability program, because those rates had been frozen for so long. They were individuals who are more likely to be visible, minority, and of First Nations descent. And so that in the depths of poverty, that was about half of our population were people that we could actually, were already in the system, and we just didn't have the right kinds of, we weren't doing a very good job with the system that we had, though BC had made strides in this area to move forwards in these targets. The other half of the individuals were, I think, what C is talking about, people who are in fact working, but they are not in very, they're not in high paid, they're not in very good work conditions. They are in, you know, this gig economy kind of work area. The Canada Workers Benefit is not well designed. It should in fact help them, but it is not well designed. And BC eliminated its supports to top up the Canada Worker Benefit to instead plow its money into its Child Opportunity Benefit instead. And so there was a lot of reduction for support of low-wage workers. You know, so that was the context in which we were coming into this. And, you know, when we were looking particularly at former youth in care, and my background is, you know, my parents abandoned me when I was 16 years old. I had to find my way at a very young age, and it was not a very pretty experience. And it is really, really important that people remember that you're not an adult at 16, you're not an adult at 18, and you're not an adult at 20 by any stretch of the imagination. And what we have to do as society and as a government is be those parents for those kids. The better we can be a parent for those kids then, the less we're going to see them in the system later on, because former kids aging out of care, when we don't support them right then and there, you know where we see them? Income assistance system. They make up a large portion of recipients in the income assistance system. So those are a group of individuals who need a different kinds of support. They don't just need income. They do need income. They need very specific kinds of supports that they need much more hand-on. They need much more one-on-one support of care workers, which again, governments just love. You know, I'm in Alberta, you can appreciate this, right? These are the kinds of workers that get cut, as though they have no value in the lives of these individuals, whereas they do. And so, you know, when we were making our recommendations, again, understanding that 80% of what the BC government was offering was in services, and that, you know, when we look at how much they were offering in income support, we targeted our recommendations at youth aging out of care. We targeted it at people with disabilities, because we also knew that the federal government was getting ready for a federal Canadian disability benefit, and we wanted the province to be ready to work with the federal government to ensure that finally we would have a federal provincial system where people with disabilities would no longer live in poverty. And we wanted to ensure that the definition of people with disabilities would not be set by the federal government, it would be set by the province, and it would be set expansively, not narrowly, using the definition used in the disability tax credit, which is where the feds would go if you let them. And then what we also wanted to do
Lindsay,
was,
you know, we'll have to, we have about 30 seconds left for this time slot.
well, that's okay. I can take other people's time. And then the last thing we did was make recommendations to Ottawa to change the system so it was ready to be able to deliver a CERB when it needed to deliver a CERB.
So for the next question, it will be directed towards Floyd. Floyd, UBI Works has listed 8 ways UBI could be financed in Canada. And during your discussion with Erin, you briefly mentioned a possible preference for a microtax on electronic transactions. Can you expand on this? And also any other option you think would be the most effective?
Yeah, so firstly, just to anchor this a bit, it's been shown through napkin math in the National Post that a basic income guarantee could cost as little as a net cost of $24 to $30 billion. That would be roughly a 3% GST increase. 3% more expensive products, and we end poverty and all the other benefits we've spoken of here. You can make up that 30 billion in many ways. There's tens of billions in tax credits that currently help mostly the wealthy or subsidizing corporations. Our banking and natural resource sector has among the lowest tax rates in the G7 for no reason. I don't know why. That could pay for the basic income. Our GST and the HST across the country is half of the European average. Raising that to the European average would raise $70 billion or more, which would more than pay for a far more generous basic income. Up to nearly $2,000 a month CERB levels. Not a demo grant, a guarantee. There's $46 billion in tax expenditures to support tax breaks for the RSP and TFSA programs, which mostly helps the top 15% of our income earners who have enough money to save anyway. It doesn't help low-income people. Our tax system rewards unproductive speculation investment gains with lower tax rates than applies to labor. How does that make any sense? The cost of poverty itself has been estimated to be $86 billion, not even including the cost savings we could have by reduced crime, improved health. There's many hundreds of billions in what you could call unearned income or economic rents in economist terms. that the profession is aware of but is not speaking about, because I think it goes too much against vested interests that could pay for a very generous basic income and is, if anything, hurting our productive economy, our real economy right now. And the specific tax reform that you asked about is kind of a futuristic one. As we're moving more towards electronic payments and various shapes or forms, turns out that we've estimated that a 0.2% tax on electronic transactions, like if you take money from your left hand and put it in your right hand, that's taxed at 0.2%. That could raise $160 billion. That would pay for of the most generous guaranteed basic income you could design. That would actually extend the benefit all the way up into upper middle class earners, just like the Canada Child Benefit does, which would get the middle class on side. Because I'm very sensitive to the point that was raised in the BC panel report, which basically I feel was constrained by the sensibilities of middle income workers. Why should they pay for it? Well, there are basic incomes that can make that beneficiaries. And in the 8 Ways to Pay article on UBI Works, we modeled a blended model that includes a $500 a month dividend as part of, with a guaranteed basic income of $2,000 a month built on top of it. And in that model, we showed 8 ways to pay for that. And so I think it's a matter of political will. And that model was forecasted by the Canadian Centre of Economics Analysis in a recent report, and it showed that certain ways of paying for it could lead the net beneficiaries go all the way up into to people, households who make $109,000. That's the majority of the voting base that might get on side if they see that a basic income is good for them, and not only for people in poor circumstances.
Okay, thank you. There's a little bit of a follow-up question that came to mind. Could you tell us about how you think basic income can actually support economic growth and entrepreneurship, and in what ways it can positively impact businesses, the future of work, and even innovation?
Right. So when I organized 120 Canadian CEOs, and I myself run a mid-sized business, a global business, I've started businesses in several countries around the world. The CEOs who signed on to that letter in 2018, they were asking Doug Ford to not cancel the Ontario pilot. Had a lot of different reasons for joining, but about a quarter of them said, we think entrepreneurship should not only be accessible to the children of wealthy people. And the studies show that that's increasingly the case. If you're lower income, if you grew up in precarious environments, you're very limited by the means that you have, literally the financial means. And that, I think, is unjust, and frankly, it's unproductive to the economy. We need to unlock our potential. Everyone knows that innovation, wealth creation, societal wealth creation is driven by largely innovation, and that requires taking risks. So if people have the means to take risks, large or small, that's only going to be better for the economy, whether it's starting your next business or whether it's holding out longer for a better job or staying in school longer if that's what you need to. Sam Altman, who's the president of Y Combinator, Silicon Valley's most celebrated incubator, says that basic income is seed funding for the people. That he himself received $12,000 a year in a grant when he applied to an incubator, that allowed him to work on his business. And I personally also had something like a basic income from a rental housing source that allowed me to quit a job and start my business. If I didn't have that security, I would not have started the business at that time. Might have started a bit later because it was in my genes, but it was just had that bug. But I would have been crushed by the 2008 crisis. So timing really matters. Having people be able to take the means to take risks and follow their passions when the energy is there is really important. Not 30 years later when they've managed to save up enough to execute a dream that maybe they don't even have anymore. The Canadian Centre of Economics Analysis, in a report that was recently commissioned by by UBI Works, did analysis of 2 basic income models, including a guaranteed minimum income of roughly $2,000 a month, and showed that these schemes can create 300,000 to 600,000 new jobs and $80 billion a year to the Canadian economy. That's as much as the pre-COVID tourism and hospitality industries combined. This is literally the market forces at work when people who have a higher marginal propensity to spend because they're currently living at or below basic needs simply spend towards their basic needs. So I think we are the economy. We're leaving money on the table by having people live under basic needs and not be able to participate fully. So this report basically shows that an economy without a basic income could have less jobs and be less larger. One of the interesting projections they show is that as people spend more money, it induces businesses to hire. Businesses only produce on the expectations of future sales. So if you know that your customer base is capitalized, that you can predict better revenue, you're going to hire more. And one of the dynamics the report exposes that a basic income could produce $24 billion a year in additional private capital investments. That's 3 times more than Canada's venture capital ecosystem invests right now. And finally, in terms of the future of work, again, we are in the 4th industrial revolution. Every previous revolution left those whose work was displaced far worse off, starting all the way from the Luddites. A lot of people misunderstand the Luddites. They weren't against technology. They were against poverty level wages. They were highly skilled middle income workers who were displaced by the loom, which could equip lower skilled workers to do the same job more productively with less pay. So imagine if you were forced into low income work when you previously had a proud middle income job. Well, it started all the way from the loom, and it happened most recently, as Andrew Yang likes to talk about, those 4 million manufacturing workers, which includes my father and uncle, for the same thing happened. My father was a tool and die designer, and he said that, you know, after that apocalypse of manufacturing jobs were lost, the new design jobs were increasingly being done by software that did the thinking for you and allowed lower skilled workers to do the same work he used to do with much more skill and much more pay. So I think we are at a point in this industrial revolution where we just have to accept that labor income alone isn't going to be enough for people. I think we should share in capital income, meaning money you didn't work for, but is part of a system that you are a stakeholder in. That's the same income that the super wealthy get. If we can do that, we can have an economy where everyone can participate and feel part of the solidarity of our growing economy and be part of this future of work where they can adapt to new jobs of the future. Because I think a lot of the existing mechanisms that are typically proposed just won't work. How will more education work when we're already in a period where we have the most educated society, that is, with most educated people living in poverty, where de-skilling is continuing to happen? There's something else going on here. I think we're already in a stage of this industrial revolution where we need basic income as a transition towards who knows what comes next. But without it, we're just dooming people to despair through no fault of their own.
We have a full minute for anybody to add a contributing thought or to respond to. Is that something that anyone would like to take up before we move on? Okay, Emily.
Yes, I'll just be super quick. Just going way back to the beginning about a 3% GST increase. I understand in comparing to Europe, but Canada's provinces and federal taxes are quite low. That being said, it's often people in poverty and low-income people who are living paycheck to paycheck, and they are the ones who typically are spending the most of their paycheck on these consumer goods. And just as someone with lived experience, and as someone with a lot of peers with lived experience, I really think that's going to translate to people when they are purchasing things that aren't food or perhaps children's clothing, which are protected from sales tax. I really think they're going to feel like they're paying for this UBI. And I'm going to flag specifically for things like cell phones and laptops and electronics that are increasingly becoming necessary, but are so expensive that a 3% on that would really, really hurt them in accessing that purchase. So I encourage like a tax increase on perhaps the 1%, on perhaps the wealth, but I think just reiterating, I really think that those lower income people are really going to feel like they're actually personally paying for this UBI, and I think it's going to hurt the cause.
And because women actually spend more of their income on consumption items, women actually pay a higher burden, and that is not in fact recognized through the GST, HST. And so, a gendered lens on tax is highly needed, and not just economic efficiency is important.
Matthew, you're on mute.
Sorry. Did you want to take a minute to respond to any of that, or do you just want to let that sit?
Those are valid concerns. I mean, Andrew Yang used to claim that raising a 10% GST in the States would leave 94% of families better off. You have to be spending a lot of money per month on consumables for $1,000 a month, in his case, his plan, to leave you worse off. I think the same dynamics are here too. Yes, people would pay 3% more, but you're really talking about the top 5 to 10% of income earners that would actually be net paying out more than they would receive, assuming it was a UBI. And obviously, if it was a guaranteed basic income, I think the majority of people will be significantly better off as if they didn't have it. However, that said, yes, indeed, the Canadian Centre of Economics Analysis report did look at the impacts of different sources of funding. And effectively, they showed that the more income comes from the highest income households who have the capacity to pay, the greater the impact on economic growth, because a lot of that wealth sitting at the top is unproductive. As one of my heroes, Nick Hanover, likes to say, wealthy people can rub money together to make more money. It's not actually contributing to the real economy. But a basic income is literally from the bottom up. It's trickle up economics. So those sorts of more progressive means of taxation would be, frankly, the best for economic productivity, let alone social justice.
Good, thank you. Emily, the last question is going to be for you. From your work at CWP and the Poverty Pandemic Watch, can you tell us more about the wider impacts of poverty, such as on housing and food insecurity?
Thank you. So I'll just take a second to talk about that things like housing and food insecurity that fall under this poverty, the systemic poverty impacts, and how they're not necessarily always related to income. And sometimes it's really just supply and accessibility. So starting off with housing insecurity, often people think of this as, Toronto prices are just so high that even people who have, $40,000 a year cannot afford rent or a house. It's more than this. We really have to think about supply and things like overcrowding, and this is especially important on Indigenous reserves, First Nations reserves, because these are rural, these are remote. It's hard to get contractors out there to build more houses. There's a lot of lag in getting them proper housing, and we've seen a lot of this during the pandemic, where they have turned isolation shelters into housing, where they're in the dead of winter living in these makeshift shelters built out of plywood and tarps. So housing insecurity is also these things. Housing insecurity is also women and gender diverse people feeling like they are stuck because during a pandemic they haven't been able to access women's shelters. They haven't been able to flee their violent situations. So this isn't necessarily just an income issue. So this is where perhaps a UBI would really need to be provided with more surrounding supports. Moving into food insecurity, in the academic world, a food desert, which is meaning lack of access to nutritious and culturally appropriate food. It's not just that someone's not being able to afford it. Sometimes it's just not in their area. There's a specific neighborhood in Ottawa called the Golden Triangle, and it's off of Elgin Street. For anyone in Ottawa, you might know what I'm talking about. But my mother, who lives on Ontario Disability Support, lives in public housing and lives in a neighborhood where the only groceries she can afford are at Dollarama, which means that she's eating processed food. She's eating a lot of sugary foods, and as Evelyn was mentioning, these are the food patterns and food insecurity that lead to things like type 2 diabetes, which lead to all the other surrounding health impacts that has. So it's not that my mom can't necessarily afford food. It's just that there's no grocery store in her neighborhood that's accessible, because one, she has a disability and she can't always take the bus. She's a single woman. There's only so much she can carry. So there are these things we have to think about when we're talking about sort of eradicating poverty, when we're talking about a just economy. It's not just giving people money, it's building more sustainable and equitable cities as well. And I know that's a whole other topic, so I'll move on. But yeah, I guess I'll just talk to housing and food insecurity so I don't take up too much of my 10 minutes. But sorry, was there a follow-up question?
Indeed, there was, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a question for you. So what do you think that, what are some of the failures or the insufficiencies in current policies and programs? Additionally, who or what gets left behind in our current social assistance
Mm-hmm.
programs, and how would you hope to see a basic income address these groups?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say, first off, a big failure is that our statistics on poverty leave a lot out of the picture. So right now we, under the poverty reduction strategy, we measure poverty using the market basket measure. And for the participants, this is essentially a measure of poverty that is based on someone's area and what basic basket of goods would cost, which is like housing, food, transportation. It varies from region to region. Through our advocacy work, we're really finding that this is creating a lot of gaps, and also this market basket measure it doesn't include disaggregated data that better reflects the experiences of racialized communities, trans women, LGBTQ+. So we have a lot of missing gaps in the data. And because of this, we have poverty lines that don't actually really reflect the population. This has led to social assistance rates that are way under the poverty line and that aren't really meeting the needs of people. So right off the bat, we just have social assistance rates that are, a crime against human rights because people are so stuck on the system. Leading off of this, so many social assistance models are based off of sorry, I'm trying to collect my thoughts, if you try to work, every dollar you spend, a whole dollar, your social assistance gets clawed back. So it leaves you dependent on the system. And this is where we get these really negative stereotypes, like a welfare queen, people who are just living off the system. They're quite literally stuck because there's not enough, there's no time period where they can, earn enough income and collect social assistance so that they can have a little bit of money and then, transition themselves off of social assistance. This is where I think a UBI model that that doesn't claw back dollar per dollar for the extra income earned. I think a lot of the popular models are 50 cents to that extra dollar. I think these are where it's really going to benefit those people who are looking to sort of move up that income ladder, looking to advance their jobs into maybe perhaps higher paying jobs, but are just having a hard time transitioning off of social assurance. And then, because social assistance is often just offered to Canadian citizens or people with work visas, it really leaves a lot of the population out. So, really talking about people who don't file taxes, and these are people who are often homeless, operating in the underground economy, have precarious status, a lot of women and gender diverse people engaging in sex work. A lot of these people don't file taxes, so they don't really access these government benefits. And then the government sort of relies on the charitable sector to serve these populations. So things like food banks, community centers, and this is just a patchwork of services that, an individual, let's say you're a homeless individual trying to access services, you have to go to your food bank for one thing, a church for some clothing, and it's quite difficult, and it makes one person's day-to-day life quite challenging, on top of just the stigma that they experience trying to access these places. It can be really hard to admit that you need help sometimes, and as encouraging as these spaces try to be, it's there's a lot of stigma to poverty. It's often seen as a very personal fault thing. And I think those are the main issues I wanted to bring forward to sort of why our social assistance system is broken. But just to reiterate, I really think that implementing a UBI that doesn't punish people for trying to perhaps move above the, if there's sort of just around that poverty line, trying to move above it, not clawing back every dollar that they earn, really allowing them to just create a little bit of safety and security for them so that they can, have some savings, have a little cushion, so, they can transition to, maybe move to a new apartment, search for a new job because perhaps their current job just isn't working with them, causing them mental health issues, and every day feels like a struggle, but they can't quit because if they quit, they have no safety. So I'll leave it at that.
No, thank you. The first question is coming in from Dorina, who writes, UN goal number 1 is to eliminate poverty. So why is it so much work to be done? Why is it that there is so much work to be done up front to convince both the public and politicians of these things? So I'll leave that open for anybody who wants to jump in first. And we have, just so you all know, about, let's say we started 10 minutes late, so let's go till 8:10 max.
I'll just quickly jump in because I sort of spoke to this. I think we're often optimistic that everyone wants to help people in poverty, but there are still a lot of people who just need to be educated and really think that people are in poverty because they don't have a job and they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and this is not the case. So, you know, there's a lot of work to educate Canadians and people in Canada to understand sort of the root causes and systemic issues around poverty.
Well, we can't even agree on how to define poverty. So it's, even when we do, right? I mean, the BC government and the federal government have set the MBM as their poverty, and I appreciate the strengths and weaknesses and what have you, but it set it in, and now even when we start talking about whether or not we're meeting those targets, we then end up in arguments about whether or not that's even the right target. So if we can't even fundamentally agree on what poverty is and how to measure it and how to make strides on it, politicians take advantage of that to say, then why, that's what they take advantage of in their programs, to say, this is why, you know, there's not that much value in having a poverty reduction strategy, because in the end, we all just end up arguing about statistical artifacts and what have you. And I mean, that happened when the MBM came out, and, you know, the Conservative Party of Canada attacked Stats Can for saying that that's a poverty measure, when, I mean, they were arguing that it was, they were following the direction of the Prime Minister, as opposed to it being an academic exercise. So I appreciate, this seems like it should be a simple issue, but it is actually incredibly complex.
Okay, thank
I have
you. Floyd,
harsh, kind of a harsh interpretation of this is that I think it's been shown that the number one predictor of voter turnout is property ownership. So if you already have money and you already have, you know, a place, your own property, you're going to vote because the parties will determine your outcomes. I've seen other research that shows that for major social change to happen, you have to convince middle-income voters that this is going to be good for them. So that's why when people are tricked into thinking that lower taxes for the wealthy will benefit them, they'll vote for that. And I think one of the genius of Andrew Yang, the presidential campaign, was explaining why basic income is actually for you. It's actually for middle income workers, because your jobs are at risk from automation. In fact, the data shows that it is middle income workers who have not seen a pay raise in 40 years, as automation is doing more and more of the work. So our strategy at UBI Works is to focus the discussion on bread and butter topics, simple narratives that will appeal to centrist middle income people, with knowing full well that everyone else's agenda on this call will be missed. Obviously, we want to address poverty. Obviously, we want people to live better lives. But when we talk about poverty, it's not, it may not move the needle on voting strategy. And at the end of the day, I believe basic income requires an election mandate. And to win an election, you have to have a broad and centrist message, which is why UBI Works focuses so much on these economic narratives, and we funded the research from the Canadian Centre of Economics Analysis. We're on the same team. We're just playing a different game.
Any other response before we move on to the next question? Okay. So Moira and I'm embarrassed to say that I've not been able to pronounce this as much as I've known of this journal for a long time. Moira at the Tai is asking Dr. Teds, so Lindsay, in regards to the concerns on povertism raised by people in BC after the recent report on basic income, people who receive disability assistance are saying the suggestion of reforming the system ignores how much it already polices disabled people and those on other forms of assistance, and makes it impossible to get off of assistance for those who want to. Could you respond to those concerns and perhaps elaborate on how you consulted affected people in this report. And she points out that anyone else can also respond.
Well, I think I've already answered that, right? I mean, our panel came in after a 1.5 year extensive consultation. We had all of those documentations and we used that. I mean, the context in British Columbia is not the same context as it is in other provinces. And in fact, the recommendations that we that we made on disability income had been made a number of times in the past, not only coming from the community itself, but by previous expert panels. All of this documentation is up on our website. So, you know, no matter what, if we're going to have, one of the biggest controversies in the basic income is whether or not it's a flat benefit for everybody, or whether or not we have to acknowledge that different people have different expenses, and we have to acknowledge that within a basic income. And in a basic income, one of the biggest carve-outs that people argue for, and rightfully so, is for people with disabilities. And that's because the expenses that they have are vastly higher than anybody else. And that does, in fact, have to be acknowledged. And then as soon as you're there, you're going to have an adjudication system for disabilities. You're going to have to define disability, and we end up right back where we are. So our recommendations were about, in fact, making sure that we were taking a broader definition of disability, given some of the problems that we were having in BC. We wanted to make sure that addiction was acknowledged as a disability, and where you could, in fact, get onto disability and not just on persons with multiple barriers, which is where they are now. Want to make sure mental health was covered under the disability system. We also wanted a disability system which was flexible to allow, Evelyn talked about, you know, conditions which are relapsing and remitting, and kind of relate to that one, and where you're going to have times in your life where you can work and not work, and you should be able to move in and out of the system flexibly without being kicked out of the disability system. You should be able to work without your benefits being clawed back. You know, these are all the recommendations that we were making in this report. And these are issues that would, in fact, have to be confronted in a basic income system, no matter what, because of the costs of people with disabilities. You can't give everybody the same benefit and expect for that to be a fair outcome.
Okay, anybody else have a contributing thought? Okay, so the next question is coming in from Aaron, who asks, what are the risks that may arise when the same banking system that is often abused by speculative financial practices, as Floyd already mentioned, would be the same one used to finance UBI? What kind of regulation, like banning speculative financing with a national currency or separating the national fund for UBI from these volatile practices, could be recommended? I think that he's referring to things possibly like Glass-Steagall sorts of reforms being discussed in the US, or similar things for Canada. So does anybody have a thought on that point?
I don't think anyone's talking about the banking system regulating a social program. That's not even in the discourse. However, I do think I am very disturbed by the fact that I think our current banking system is continually moving the goalpost on what's creating more poverty. The more and more our property rises are skyrocketing, the higher rents are going, and the more poverty becomes a problem. And we've already seen in the last few generations what used to be possibly generous levels of social assistance become subsistence levels, or even less than poverty. So what do we do about that? I think the banking system is profiting off of this dynamic, and is paying less tax than most countries in the G7. And there is an opportunity for them to pay more tax that could pay for those who've been most impacted by this dynamic of ever skyrocketing housing prices, which is increasingly being driven since 2008 by money printing, which is also hurting the purchasing power for everybody else too.
I can chime in a little bit here, because the Bank of Canada is in fact working on a synthetic currency. And we have the experience out of New Zealand using synthetic currencies and welfare cards, to very concerning. And I mean, talk about combating autonomy. And of course, you know, the transferability of synthetic currency just drives me bonkers. You know, here it is, we have a government that this is a safe place. We have a currency that is strong, it's accepted everywhere. Directly transferable, I can use it to buy anything, and somebody seems to think that creating a synthetic currency is going to provide more autonomy to individuals when you can't use it anywhere and everybody can track it. Restrictions can be put on it by the government as to where recipients can use it. So yeah, I would have liked to have read that whole question so I could see the exact words, but I couldn't find it in the scrolly thing. But I'm always wary about these convoluted kind of systems. I mean, the Canadian dollar is fine. Let's just use it.
Okay. Anyone else, or do we go on to the next question?
I have seen arguments that while central banks are printing money and mostly putting it towards what they think is productive uses by lending it to home buyers and stuff like that, a lot of it is contributing to speculation. That's just making, again, moving the goalpost on poverty to an ever more difficult situation. So if we can print trillions of dollars and lend it to people that we think are worthy of deciding how it's to be spent, why not start it do that from the bottom up, make a trickle up economy with some of that investment, which has already happened with CERB and has been proven to work. Royal Bank of Canada did analysis recently showing that CERB has been responsible for a lot of the increase in consumer spending, and 2/3 of our economy is consumer spending. Now, I'm not proposing wide-scale money printing to pay for UBI through a central bank digital currency that competes with Bitcoin, but there is an argument to be made that the other way around of only trusting those who are making purchasing decisions and businesses is a form of elitism that is past due.
Okay, we have about 7 minutes left and more questions than we can possibly get to. And so preemptively, I'm just going to apologize for those who will not be able to have their questions posed. The next one, Nick, a lot of people fell through the cracks of CERB and did not qualify for government help. Would UBI catch these people? Ideally, what would the minimum qualifications be for someone to receive UBI in Canada? First come, first serve.
I'll just speak to this. I think I've been sort of talking about the cracks in our social assistance system. And one thing that left a lot of people out of reach for CERB was this $5,000 yearly threshold. And this really left a lot of people out because first, there was just confusion around the eligibility, and a lot of caseworkers are required to encourage people to apply to services that are the most easily accessible. So a lot of people applied for CERB and are now getting hit with these repayment letters, and that's a whole issue in itself. But just, you know, a UBI that is available to everyone, I would personally argue, even, you know, benefits for people who don't even sorry, my mind is starting to get Zoom fatigue, but benefits to people who aren't engaging with the formal tax system, I would argue for that. But, you know, a UBI, I think the pro of a UBI is it would be even more inclusive than CERB, which left out those people who were making just under $5,000. And those are the people who needed the most and really didn't have access to other benefits. So it was quite unfortunate.
Any system you design, people are going to fall through the cracks without a shadow of a doubt. No administrative system is going to capture anybody. The worst system you can use is the tax system. One of the better systems that you can use is a multi-pronged system with boots on the ground where you're delivering it everywhere and everybody and everything. And then you're racking up some administrative costs there. But in the end, you know, C's talked a lot about this, in the end, so long as we still have a system that the institutional power is based off of colonialism, sexism, the patriarchy. I mean, you can throw every word here. The people that are most targeted by that system are not going to apply to that system because no matter what, they are going to be stigmatized by that system because the institutional power does it to them. So there is no perfect system here. There are worse systems. There are better systems. There is no 100% system.
Okay, last takers. All right. Oh, Evelyn?
If I can, I agree with what Lindsay just said, but I think eliminating the conditionality imposed by prior work history or prior earnings would go a long way towards including more people in that system.
I think this might be the last question, depending on what happens next. Which among you, Dominic asks, which among you support a pure UBI, and which among you think that this should be based on income level?
Define universal.
So in Canada, the discourse has largely been about income-tested, guaranteed basic income. UBI Works maybe stands as a slight black sheep in the movement, where we support both. We're for guaranteed basic income as the most urgent, most practical next step to address the most urgent problems facing in our society, as a first step towards what could be a larger economic reform that could lead to a pure UBI, as you say, but depending on how it's funded, it has to be funded from what you could largely call publicly created wealth or publicly harmed wealth. And that's something that we're not even talking about as a society right now. And I think that is a way that we could capture, as Andrew Yang would put it, our share of technological change, making technology benefit everyone. But that's not the most urgent thing to do. And it's unrealistic for a lot of reasons that Dr. Ted's pointed out in the report. But I frankly think it just simply hasn't even really been about. It really depends on where the money comes from. So we're for a guaranteed basic income first, because it can be done for as little as a 3% GST increase, or in a variety of other means that are within the reach of the tax system today, and would not cost the middle class very much, depending on how it's designed.
So I'm going to have to go because my 7-year-old really wants dinner, and it's just after 6 o'clock here.
That's fine.
So I'll just say one last point. You know, if we take out the principles that I've talked about, although actually if we keep a lot of them, the climate action dividend is a basic income, and it's very similar to the Alaska Dividend Fund, and it pays out very similarly. So one could argue we already have a universal basic income. It's delivered to the majority of the population. It doesn't have, the only condition on it is that you have to be a tax filer. And it is a demo grant. So there you go. We have a universal basic income. This argument is over. Sorry, I'm not in a position. But from that pure basis, the climate action dividend is in fact a demo grant from that aspect. And so with that, I'm very sorry. I'm going to sign off here. I wish you all, I thank you very much for having me here. And sorry.
No, thank you for everyone for being here and taking the time. I've got to say I'm in pain because some of the last questions are very close to my heart. There were questions I was hoping to also pose, and maybe I'll just send an email or two to some of you the speakers today, and that can be made available. I learned a lot. I really do appreciate again the lessons and the sharing that occurred tonight. I'm gonna, I suppose, just close it up by handing the baton back to our organizers and see what they have to say.
Thank you very much, Matt. I really appreciate you handing the baton on to me. So I'm just going to say a brief few words just before everybody signs off, and then our audience is free to go. So first of all, I do want to extend a very sincere thanks to our moderator and a very dear friend of mine, Matt. Thank you very much for your time tonight. And I encourage both our panelists and the audience members to look at the work that Matt and his colleagues have been doing at the Rising Tide Foundation. I also want to extend really with the deepest sincerity to all of our panelists. We cannot express really how humbling it is to have you all here with us today. All of us here have been keeping up to date with this discourse and this conversation, and this has really been a great opportunity for us. And on a final note, I also want to just extend a thank you to both Jason and Catherine, who are who's the professor and the professor's assistant in this project. We really thank you guys again for working with us and helping us through this project. And without further ado, I'm going to wish our audience a good night, and thank you very much for joining us.